Eric is not only too tall, but he's too kind in his presentation. I indeed had the honor of being the chairman of a jury for the M+ competition. And as you can judge from what Lars told, in describing briefly what the brief was for the M+, it wasn't an easy task, or at least I expected it not to be an easy task. There were more than 100 competitors. 6 finalists were chosen. Out of those 6, 3 of them were from Japan, which is interesting statistically. Maybe because of Victor's affection for Japanese architecture, which is fully understandable. And the other 3 were Western, and not only Western, but actually European architects. Their names are up here on the screen. They were all, in a sense, very famous architects, very well-established architects, also architects who have a phenomenal track record of working on museum projects, not only museum projects, but very large museum projects around the world. They're also architects who all had very strong local partners in Hong Kong. Herzogen de Meuron, the winning project, are associated with Farrell's in Hong Kong. And they all had in common one thing, which is that they were totally dedicated to this competition. They all wanted to win it. And they all put their best people, and all the principals came to make the presentations here in Hong Kong. It was actually rather touching to see how much they really wanted to get this competition, all of them. Understandably, because the M+ competition was probably the most important architectural international competition projects put on the market, so to speak, in the last 10 years. Everybody wanted to be part. And what I will do is, the Herzogen de Meuron project won, I must say, by a substantial margin, almost the majority of the jury, which I didn't expect. I thought it would be really a difficult fight to the finish. That they would be, we did the final jury at the Jockey Club building in Causeway Bay, and I thought it would be like fighting for each horse until we would determine the winner. It actually was a fairly easy choice. Not because the other competitors were not anywhere comparable in terms of quality, but for a number of reasons which I will try to explain. What is interesting is that the Herzogen de Meuron project doesn't stand on its own. It does stand within the ecology of all the 6 projects. And it's difficult to actually isolate it from that context, because those projects represent, in a way, a cross-section of contemporary architectural practice around the world. And as such, I find that every one of them is indeed fundamental. So I will try, I have very little time, so I will try and give a short description of each project for 1 minute each. 1 minute description of 3 of their positive characteristics, 1 minute description of 3 of their negative characteristics, including the Herzogen de Meuron project, and then a sort of short summary. So it's a very, I will only be scratching the surface of the different qualities of this project, and I apologize for that. Later on, Ascan from Herzogen de Meuron will be describing the winning project in more detail. So I have the task of actually talking about the ones who lost as much as I'm talking about the winner. So the first one, I think I have the first one is Snohetta from Norway, from Oslo. And that presentation was probably one of the most seductive presentations of all. This image was the first image that they sort of used as the key representation of their project. And as you can see, it is a particular view of Hong Kong, which is quite unexpected. A sort of rather dramatic view, tempestuous view, black and white, stormy weather, quite dark and quite dramatic, a sort of Sturm und Drang spirit. And I think what they were doing is they were trying to get at Lars. You know, being a Scandinavian firm, they thought Lars, being Swedish, will be moved by this image. And I think they were actually quite right. Lars was moved by this image. And in fact, you know, they didn't show snow in Hong Kong, but it was close to showing snow. And Lars was very touched by it. And indeed, in a sense, he had to be almost rescued from an irrational love affair with this project, which we all were touched by. As a scheme, it's very simple. It's actually a vast horizontal plane which is flipped into the vertical, as you can see from this image. And both the vertical screen and the horizontal one is a sort of perforated membrane, perforated mask that allows the light into the museum spaces below and the museum spaces above or behind. That project had a magnificent way of framing and displaying the skyline of Hong Kong Island behind it. It also showed how in the lower areas, it had a series of movable screens that could frame different aspects of that extraordinary landscape and could actually lend itself to different curatorial interpretations of the space. It engaged with the landscape in a very clever way. And this image is a useful image because it shows how the horizontal plane and the vertical plane come together, and is a clear representation of what the project was. Now, the positive criticism. The first one is that we all felt that this project was indeed aesthetically one of the most fascinating projects, one of the best presented projects. It had a very strong cinematic quality. It made open references to Jim Jarmusch, the filmmaker, and particularly his film Down by Law. And it has an amazing ability to frame the landscape, to frame the view, the way a cinematographer frames views. So that was a strong feature. The second one is that it was a clear, simple concept. In competitions, it's always a good bet to go for strong, simple concepts because the juror's attention span is sometimes limited. So basically, horizontal, vertical, simple articulation, a very strong, clear partie, architectural partie. And thirdly, it showed a very good integration of the building within its context, but I won't expand on that. The negative side, let me just show you a few more slides of it. The negative side are three. First one is that it's a project that didn't have a really clearly resolved internal organization. It didn't really respond to the M+ requirement for a highly flexible, adaptable space. It was quite a complex organization and quite a rigid one and quite chaotic, if I could use that term. It was like a labyrinth. And the architects admitted that they hadn't actually been able to push the internal organization as clearly as the external view. The second one is that it clearly had a striking facade, as you can see, but in a way that facade was very much a mask, what we call in architectural jargon, the decorated shed. It put more emphasis on the facade than it put on the spaces that were behind the facade. And as you can see on this image, vaguely, the building behind the facade is a pretty generic, pretty banal, pretty ordinary building, which is the price you pay for emphasizing the screen. And then thirdly, the aesthetic of that facade was very much anchored in op art, in optical art, one of the movements of the last century art scene. And in a sense, that is probably a mistake. When you're doing a museum of contemporary art, there's only three solutions. Either you invent a style, an architectural language, which is completely new, which nobody has seen before, and therefore is in a way cannot be put in a category, or you do a fairly neutral project, a fairly tabula rasa, blank slate project, or you do one which is adaptable. But one which is very clearly identifiable aesthetically is potentially a mistake as a partie for a museum. The second architect is Toyo Ito. As you know, a famous Pritzker-Prize architect. He spoke here 2 days ago about his wonderful, most recent projects, as well as a very humble project for a hut. Toyo Ito came up with a very, very beautiful project, a project which has his signature style of suggesting very, very thin slabs of concrete, incredibly slender, with very little obvious structural presence, supported by a forest of columns which open up, which are very organic columns, which open up a bit like a lotus flower, a bamboo shoot, into these very unusual architectural statement of a column. The diagram is very simple, the way in which those slabs are perforated by the columns. There's another feature of the project which is essential, is its vertical stratification into three very, very identifiable layers. When Lars was talking about the plurality of interpretations of the different possible art events and art curating within the museum, Toyo Ito responded by creating three very different kind of conditions in the building. One would be what he calls the earth layer, which is the first 2 or 3 stories of building. Above it, the forest layer, and above it, the cloud layer. And you could see in this image how indeed the cloud layer is very bright, allows natural light, allows a very strong presence of a sky in the work. The middle one is a natural reference, and the bottom one it lends itself more to audiovisual art and cinematic presentations and so forth. And this is an expression of the middle layer, the green layer. He talked 2 days ago about one of his projects where he does sky gardens, and this is very much part of his signature and a very seductive part of his signature. So the positive criticism was, A, we were very struck by this poetic and very beautiful architectural partie. Secondly, we were very, very interested in the fact that Toyo Ito used this project to redefine the column. We as architects have lived with the column for thousands of years, and the column has stayed the same since Egyptoid days. And Toyo Ito reinvented the column. He finally did something where the column unfolds and becomes actually usable space. And this is a tour de force of architectural design. And we were seduced by that. And the third thing, I think this differentiation of the project between earth and garden and sky was a very inspiring metaphor. On the negative side, 3 things. First one is that you pay the price. The columns, wonderful as they are problematic for M+ and would have been problematic for the curators, because they are a very strong design statement, a strong artistic statement in their own right. They're strong pieces of sculpture, which would be difficult for the curator to know how to engage with. Second one is that they had functional constraints too. They made it very difficult to reconfigure the space because of the significance of their presence in the space. And then thirdly, you could say that this wonderful Garden of Eden, this layer in between, beautiful as it is also presenting the curator and the museum with a dilemma. What do we do with this garden? Can we change it? Can the curator then allow it to mutate into something different? And that is a key. To what extent are we having to continue to preserve this garden as such, or to what extent can we change it? And that was, in a way, became one of the Achilles' heel of this wonderful project. Next one is Sana, a very different project again. Not 1 building, but 10 buildings. A very daring proposition. We're not going to give you 1 building, we're going to give you 10 buildings. And these 10 buildings were 10 cubes of different sizes, of different characteristics, to house, indeed, and you heard from Lars, to house all the different manifestations of contemporary art, from ink drawings to performance art to video to film to etc. And therefore, each one of them had a specific character. They were sort of fine-tuned to be a specific character. The result is 10 buildings that all have different sizes, different orientations, reacting to different parts of the site in Hong Kong, behind the site, and west and east, and north and south. Quite a complex, and as you go up in the floors, it becomes even more complex, because the articulation of these 10 boxes becomes amazingly varied. And the result is a building that has the charm of having very different facades, very differentiated appearance. So those are the 3, if I could say, the 3 key positive reactions or criticisms was first, what a fantastic idea to treat a museum, to treat a building, not as a building, but as a city. To see it as a fragment of this urban fabric, which was one of the things which the M+ competition was asking for, and not only a piece of the urban fabric, but very typical of the Hong Kong urban fabric, the complexity of the arrangements of parts. The second thing is that we were impressed by the specificity of the approach of the design, that every component of the building actually lent itself very clearly to whether it was a black box or what we call white cubes and so forth, and it did it with incredible dexterity. And then lastly, I would say aesthetically, the positive criticism was that it was a building, or it could have been a building, that had an amazing variety and an element of surprise, and the fact that you would only, like a city, you would not understand it at first glance. You would only understand it by going through a promenade architecturale through it. Again, 3 very positive points. On the negative side, these qualities bring the problems again. First, the circulation was much too complex. The circulation was a spaghetti of lifts, of elevators, of ramps, of stairs, of pedestrian walkways and bridges and so forth, just like Hong Kong. So an amazingly complex infrastructure of movement, which would have turned M+ director and curators crazy in terms of trying to move things around from the archive, from the reserves to the exhibition spaces. So that was the first negative aspect. The second one is that, which we didn't really take into account to that extent, but still, it would have been very expensive to build because of the complexity of the different parts, and very expensive to maintain. A lot of exposure to the outside environment, a lot of need for air conditioning, for et cetera, et cetera. I won't expand on that. But more importantly, the criticism was that this building would be incredibly inflexible. By fine-tuning the parts to the different requirements of the program, it kind of became one which would be very difficult to change. What happens if suddenly ink drawing disappears from the collection? What happens if suddenly performance arts requires 2 or 3 times the amount of space? What happens indeed envisioning what happens in the future? And that project, beautiful as it is, has the difficulty of being too specific in the roles that each one of its component parts would play. So those 3 were the 3 critical points which damaged the chances of this project from winning. Shiguro Ban is another completely different type of proposition. Shiguro Ban proposed this hexagonal structure which has a funny hat on it, and the special quality of this project was that it's a responsive building which is designed to respond to changes in environmental conditions, to change between night and day, to change between winter and summer, to be able to respond differently to days when there are typhoons and when it has to close in and cover itself up, or to open up on a cool, temperate, good day. So it was an unusual project in terms of that emphasis on flexibility, or rather responsiveness. Here is probably the most typical view. It opens up. You can see the flaps open here. And the flaps, like a sort of tea cozy, you discover that behind the flaps is actually a project not so dissimilar from Sejima's project, from Sana's project. In other words, an accumulation of different sub-elements within the volume. This was the partie that Shiguro Ban used for the Pompidou Metz building in France, of which he was the designer, and very similar to Sana in a way, but also with some of the problems of the Sana. But anyway, that presentation put a lot of emphasis on the, as you can see here, on the flexible systems that would allow this building to respond to different environmental conditions. So, positive points for it was, first, finally, a building that is alive. Most of architecture is inert. Most of architecture is, don't want to use the word dead, but passive. You know, buildings are what they are. They are unchangeable masses. And this one is a responsive building which is trying to change its appearance all the time. And that is something which we're very interested in. Second one is that it's quite a strong iconic presence, but I won't dwell on that. It's a strong little jewel on the peninsula of Kowloon. And the third one is that, like the Sana project, is actually quite a rich assemblage of parts, a rich differentiation between the different elements of a program that make it up. On the negative side, 3 points again. First point is, in summary, that it is indeed very responsive to environmental changes, but there was no evidence that it was responsive to internal changes. To what extent, indeed, and I've said this point about Sana, to what extent would the unknowable future of the art world be responded to by this building? Could it change? Could these blocks be eliminated? Could they expand in size? Could there be flexibility? Was something which for us, the answer was, from what we saw, was essentially negative. The second one, and that's a very important point, is that the structure that was required, the system that was required in order to, as you can see from these images, to allow these flaps to open and close was very much overdimensioned. There would be huge hinges the size of this room to actually make it possible for these flaps to open and close. And that technology, paradoxically, was more reminiscent of 19th century machine age architecture than it is actually the current technology of intelligent materials, intelligent responsive materials. Now you can do this digitally in 1 millimeter thick membrane. You don't need to have all this gear. And so that was bizarre for a project that actually has the quality of being responsive. And then thirdly, but I won't dwell on it like some other projects, it is a difficult project to operate, a difficult project like the Sanaa project to make sure that all the distribution of the artwork from space to space in this complicated sort of pile of elements could be done. So finally Renzo Piano, the again famous architect from Italy, who, as you know, with Richard Rogers was the co-author of the Beaubourg, the Pompidou Museum in Paris, probably the most important change in museum concepts, not just, as Lars is saying, not just in terms of a building, but also the approach to museal curating of the last century, by far. So here comes Renzo Piano, very much expected to produce an interesting building, who worked enormously on it and probably overspent the budget by 4 or 5 times, produced a building which was very, very interesting in the sense that as you can see, there were two ideas in the architectural party. First one was to raise the building above the ground to create a big public space on the ground floor, and he called it a raft above, that's his metaphor, above the ground. And secondly, to put the whole collection, the whole archive of the building, the archive that is now growing day by day, the archive of M+, in this box up in the sky. A very strong architectural statement. He called it a safe. And he had the guts to do a presentation which was essentially in the form of hand drawings, very clear, simple hand drawings. And you can see on this image how he shows the raft lifted above ground on a steel truss, on a big steel truss, and how again above that flies the safe with the collection. Again, an important aspect of that project was the link between Kowloon Station and the elements and that whole little microcosm of urbanism to the north and the south of the water and the sea, and the fact that he establishes a very strong diagonal linking the project to its context. The diagrams were very seductive. Top right is the very clear expression of this safe deposit box. The bottom left is that diagonal across the site, and the middle left is this very clear image of a raft flying above the ground. The positive reaction to this project, the 3 positives, was yes, the creation of a large public space beneath the building is a very strong architectural gesture and very strong gesture towards the city and towards the public. This is what both Renzo and Richard did in Pompidou, very successfully. That huge public square in front of the Pompidou was one of the key aspects of its international success. So here again, Renzo was trying on the ground floor to create very successfully a very public, very urban public square. Second one is that the gesture of putting that safe in the cube above the building is indeed a clever architectural party in the sense it could be seen for everywhere in Hong Kong. It could be visible as being, this is our treasure, this is our new collection. And the third one is that, as you saw from the drawings, a good connection with Kowloon Station and with and with the sea. Negative side, first, the raising of the building above ground actually resulted in very substantial amounts of structural investment and excessive one, too much structural expressionism as a result. The second one is as a safe, seductive as it is as an architectural party, is difficult to manage. How, it was like the fly tower of an opera house. Why put all the pieces up there? And then Lars and his team would spend their time having to shift and raise the artwork up to that space and down again. Indeed, it's a safe, but it's not probably the right metaphor to use for a flexible museum building. And then thirdly, the aesthetic we found was in a sense too caught up in the language of high-tech language of what is now the last century, a language that was very significant as a sort of phase of modernism or late modernism, but now was sort of a bit dated compared to again the demands of a new museum. Herzoger de Meuron, I will be brief. Lars already showed some preview images. The key indeed is that all the and Askan will go in much more detail. All the exhibition spaces, or majority of the exhibition spaces, are in the horizontal slab. The vertical slab contains some of the museum spaces and all the administration and restaurant and other ancillary spaces, but it also holds this giant screen, this giant electronic screen, which would display work either by the artist being exhibited or by other artists who would have access to the screen as a playground, as a way to experiment with their own work. So the ground floor is free, again, like most of the architectural parties, open to the public. And then the card, the interesting card which Herzoger de Meuron played is that they then suggested that the underground space should be also a very significant part of the museum. The partie was expressed very clearly by these very strong diagrams, which don't need any explanation. The ground floor again revealed these wonderful views of the island. And what was, in a way, the very strong card they played was the underground layer, the layer beneath the surface. Herzoger de Meuron, in a way, did a bit of sort of inventive archaeology, because after all, the site is very new. So it's not like discovering Roman ruins. But they discovered, of course, the tunnels of the Airport Express and the MTR, and how they dig under the site, making it actually quite complex to do the structural solution. And they suggested, as they did so successfully in the Tate Modern, suggested when they uncovered the tanks, suggested that this underground space would be the third space that the M+ competition asked for, the less defined, less clean industrial found space, which could then be devoted to the more messy, the more out of control, and the more experimental, the more unexpected types of art interventions that are now becoming more and more important. And so they had these quite striking images of how this rather messy, chaotic underground space could be used. So. Very briefly, the summary of this in terms of our reaction is that first, clearly, this is a very strong, clear partie, very strong diagram, very striking diagram. Secondly, that the articulation of a building, and this is something we didn't really expect, between the top layers and the ground layers and the underground layers, this structuring into three parts, in a way the way Toyo Ito also structured it between earth and garden and sky, but in a different way, which emphasize even more the underground layer. And that notion, in architecture, one says in a way, a good architecture always has to have a basement and a ground floor and an attic. And Sigmund Freud said the psyche, the structure of the psyche is like the structure of a building. The basement is the id, and the ground floor is the ego, and the upper floors is the superego. And you could say that building is touching upon this. And in a way, in this building, Herzoger de Meuron, like they did in the Tate Modern, are suggesting that we explore the unconscious, we explore the other world, the world of things which we don't quite know. And they have the guts to actually make it one of the key the key aspects of the project, which we found very, very striking. And then thirdly, and probably most importantly, we found that this project was the one that best understood not only the existing archive of the M+, the existing possessions that are forming the starting point of the collection, but also how important it was to understand that this will change. In 10 years' time, it could be completely different. In 10 years' time, you'd have to have a flexible enough space to readjust to all the changes. And that probably was the most important positive point about the project. In terms of the negative criticism, if I could address it very briefly, there are a few points which drew some comments, which we need to address and which the architects can very easily address. First is that because like most of the other projects, this building was essentially displaying its facade to the island, to Hong Kong Island, as if this is where the spectators were of the building from a distance, and minimize the way in which it related to Kowloon, particularly to, of course, West Kowloon and to the rest of the city. Somehow this is easy for the architects to address, because that project, unlike the Snohetta project, doesn't have just one facade, it has a two-faced facade. So my feeling was that the screen, which is a debatable feature, but the screen could be a double screen addressing both the island and the rest of the city in the other direction. The second negative thing, potentially, is that we felt at some point that the building is almost too easy to understand. It doesn't have enough mystery. You can immediately get the diagram immediately, unlike Sana's project, for instance, where you would never really understand that project unless you walked through it. So that could be a weakness, but again, Herzog and de Meuron have clearly indicated that their way of revealing the underground, the unconscious, would actually be that element of mystery that would actually tilt to address that potential criticism. And then the third critique, which is going to be certainly part of a discussion on the building, is that the screen raised a few questions. First, the danger that it could be used for advertising in an embarrassing manner, perhaps, and that there's a lot of this surrounding the building already not only on Hong Kong Island, but also in Kowloon. So how would M+ address this if the screen was to be built? How would it address the way in which one would curate the use of the screen? And then the other aspect of the screen that was criticized is that its technology runs a risk of being very quickly obsolete. There's nothing that changes more quickly than the technology of large screen displays. And although there are here in Hong Kong some experts on this topic, it would be still a very difficult thing to address. I happen to be of the opinion that the screen is great, but I would be disappointed if the screen was to be sort of played down. Herzog and de Meuron, I feel, in a way, are a fairly restrained architectural firm in terms of architectural statement. They are Swiss, after all. And for once that Herzog and de Meuron is pulling a rabbit out of a hat, and not just a white rabbit, but a multicolored moving rabbit, I think it would be a shame to ask them to put the rabbit aside. So I hope that the screen survives. So finally, I've probably been a bit too long, but finally, what I've tried to do in this presentation is to show how these 6 projects actually form a kind of aviary or bestiary or ecology of contemporary architecture. They all represent, they are in a sense the elephants and the giraffes and the snakes of contemporary architectural investigations. And that's why it's difficult to extract one of them. You have to keep a whole zoo. And I hope the exhibition now at Artistry is actually showing how important that zoo of different projects is. So in summary, these are in a sense the architectural typologies or architectural investigations that they all represent. The first one, clearly, Snohetta, is the mask, the decorated shed, of which is a very important section of architectural design initiatives. Second one, Toyo Ito, is the organic. It's not as organic as some of his other projects, but it's clearly going in that direction. His play with those columns, with that garden, is very much going that direction. Third one is beautifully represented by Sana, the city, the architecture as not as a building, but as a city, as a fragment of a city. Could not think of a better illustration of this. Although, well, I don't expand on that. The third one, Shigeru Ban, the responsive, again, is very likely to be the future of architecture. Architecture is very likely to shift into the direction of moving away from its inertness and moving into be a live, organic, responsive, and surprising behavior type of animal. And I think, in a way, it was brave of Shigeru to go that way. I think he hasn't gone far enough, but it's very important that he used this competition to explore that dimension. Renzo Piano clearly represents the architecture as a piece of mechanism, as a machine. Again, the dominant metaphor that we have all been brought up in, and in the modernism, late modernism. I think that metaphor is not going to disappear. The machines are going to change, and therefore the metaphor will evolve. But it's very interesting that in the 6 projects, one of them represents that celebration of high tech, in my opinion, or in our opinion, over celebration, but of high tech. And then finally, Herzog and de Meuron. It's probably wise not to give a title to Herzog and de Meuron's project. It could be said to be laconic or diagrammatic or open-ended, or I would say probably the best way to describe it is that it is open-ended. In many ways, and you should reflect upon this, that project actually contains all the other projects. You could see that particular type is able to absorb the others, and that's why it's an interesting role to play in that ecology. I'm not sure what animal could be described as the animal that can absorb all other animals, but that's, I think, what it is. And I think it is very appropriate that actually that project won, that the open-ended project won, because it leaves the art to be really the main expression. And it actually celebrates the fact that the real architecture, the real artistic statement is still to come and is to be embedded in work that we simply have no imagination yet what it will be like, which is, I think, what Lars and his team were trying to get out of the architects. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you. Please stay on stage just for one moment. We'll have time for just one question.
One question
from the audience. But thank you so much. It was offering great insight to the ideas of the jury and the feedback, and also provides a lot of enlightenment in terms of how we, as architects, actually, our buildings are read, our buildings are understood in light of a competition. We have time for one question from the audience. Continuing the idea of the openness of showing all the work that was been done. I mean, it's also great in terms of a competition revealing the thinking behind the jury. Do we have any questions? Oh, there's one here.
Thank you, Colin. That was really good. I just wondered, if you had to evaluate these 6 submissions from an urban design point of view, which one would you have picked? Because I felt the one that won, maybe Hong Kong people would call it as a wall, although it's a screen. And I just wanted to hear your views on that. Thank you.
Sujata, coming from you, that is the most pertinent question you could ask. I was careful not actually to identify the different criteria that we use actually in looking at the projects. I think that the winning project is in fact a project, when Askan will describe it later, does address its relationship with the city very, very beautifully. It has, on the ground floor, it is a continuation of the project by Foster's, the continuation of the main avenue. It actually becomes the articulation between that new part of the city and the garden, and it actually has very strong ties both with the city on the one side, the garden on the other, water, and the background of Kowloon on the other. So I think that project will be able to respond to your question about its urban design quality. I could not dwell on it in the presentation, but it does have a weakness, and all the projects had that weakness of not really addressing sufficiently what is behind, what is to the north. The incredible fact that Kowloon, the elements and indeed the Terry Farrell building below, houses like 45,000 inhabitants. Even just behind the M+, lies an amazing piece of intense urban presence. And it's important that M+ actually not only sits next to this, but engages with it and actually helps the relationship between that terribly isolated island of urban development and the rest of Hong Kong. So I think that project lends itself well. I think I explained in some of the projects at Renzo Piano how well articulated that connection was. The interesting the Snohetta project, which is the statement of saying that this is a city, not a building. Ironically, it didn't really work on that level, because it's like, I wouldn't want to be too critical, but it is a bit like a sort of Disneyland Casbah at the foot of the ICC. None of the projects really sufficiently showed that behind it is this 150-story high Goliath of a building, which makes the relationship with a context, urban context, very, very difficult. All I can say is that I think, again, because of its open-endedness, the Herzog and de Mont project it will be able to answer your question.
Thank you, Colin.
But one question.
Yes, sorry, because of constraints of time, we only have time for one question. But please join me in thanking Colin for this wonderful presentation.